Right. Well, I'm very pleased to be here with Bill Scott at Inclusion Scotland and getting the chance to ask him a few questions and get his thoughts on Daniel Blake and the things that have been happening in welfare reform. Hello, Bill.
Hello, Daniel Blake, to start with, I think is one of the best British films that I've seen. It's very moving in a number of ways. It's very sad, obviously, at the end, and very harrowing in terms of the experiences, but there's a lot of warmth and humanity in the film where people that have literally nothing help one another and reach out to one another and support one another. And I think that's an example for those without that a lot of those with money should learn from. That sharing is actually a way that betters yourself as well as society. I think it's got wonderful performances and really well researched. We helped with some of the background research for Paul Laverty, the screenwriter, a couple of years ago, and I can say with some certainty that many of the things that occur in the film are based on experiences that disabled people have already had, unfortunately, in terms of death, at assessments, at tribunals, in terms of being turned down for the benefit and forced to register as unemployed and seek work on the basis that they're fit to work, when in fact, of course, they're not fit for work. But it's the only way that they can get any support from the state. Otherwise, they can go without benefit for months at a time. And again, we have had disabled people who have gone without any benefit for months at a time, forcing them to take choices in their life that are desperate ones, turning to prostitution, theft to survive, and being so ashamed of their actions that they've contemplated suicide. And I don't just mean, thought about it. I mean, some have made attempts, and others have had to seek counselling because they've been so badly damaged. Their mental health's been so badly damaged afterwards by what they'd been forced to do to survive.
I've read in some places that the rate of suicide has gone up since these measures have come in. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with sort of more rigorous research?
I'm familiar with the most rigorous research which is undertaken on behalf of NHS Scotland by statisticians, and the rate has definitely increased since many of these reforms were introduced, and it has increased in England also since many of these reforms were introduced. And statistics from Samaritans this week show that people in low incomes, exactly the sort of people as are featured in Daniel Blake, are 3 times more likely to attempt suicide and succeed, unfortunately, than they're better off, more affluent peers in society. So we have a situation now, where the risk of suicide has definitely increased. And of course, there's many actions short of actual suicide which do harm to a person's health. So that there's been a large increase in self-harm as well. That's turning to drink, drugs. Also, attempted suicide, but harmful behaviours by a significant portion of the working age population that have been subjected to some of the worst of the welfare reforms. So you cannot prove that one leads to the other at this stage, but there seems to be an association, and it looks likely that it has pushed more people in that direction.
Is there a particular paper? Is this public research?
It's publicly published now by I can get you the references later. I got them in my head, unfortunately. But I read it when I was putting together our response to the Health and Work Green Paper that was issued by the UK government back in November. We put in a response in February, so I saw the response from the Welfare Reform Health Impact Delivery Group, and it was a statistician employed by NHS Scotland that put together the statistics on increased number of suicides, and showed that there was a link between low income and benefit claims and the increased risk of suicide over the last few years.
So can you tell me a bit more about the breadth of Inclusion Scotland's work?
We've increased the breadth of our work quite considerably in the last 2 or 3 years. Primarily, and up until about 3 years ago actually, we were funded by Scottish Government to involve disabled people in the policy making process, and that largely meant that we would inform disabled people by various means, social media, e-bulletins, newsletters, etc., briefings, about Scottish Government plans, policies, etc., that might have an impact on disabled people's lives, and then ask the disabled people what did they think about that, how would it affect them, were there things that hadn't been thought about in putting together the policy that could improve it, and then took those views back to the Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government. And wherever possible, we try and support disabled people with lived experience to put across their views directly to policymakers. So, at some of the engagement events, we would bring MSPs, ministers, civil servants into the same room as disabled people so they could hear directly what disabled people's experience was. And we've supported people to give evidence in Parliament at parliamentary committees and things like that. So that's still a core element of our work. But as you gather those views, you identify gaps in provision and gaps in policy. And I don't think it's enough for an organisation to just complain about what isn't there. It's sometimes up to that organisation to suggest ways of filling that gap. And that's what we've begun to do in the last few years. So 3 years ago, we began an equalities intern scheme where we began placing disabled people with voluntary sector organisations so that they could get work experience. And from the outset, we thought it was important that they were paid to do that and not on a voluntary basis. They weren't working for their benefits, but instead they were receiving a decent wage. At first it was minimum wage, but we've fought for and won the right to pay them the living wage. And in the last few years, we've generally supported about 30 internships a year in either the voluntary sector or, for a short while, we also had a parliamentary intern scheme where we supported young disabled people to become interns to MSPs in the Parliament. And we thought that was really important because we thought that would be a two-way process where the young disabled people would get work experience, increase their chances of employment later on, but they'd also get an insight into the policy-making process, how the Parliament worked, etc. But at the same time, they'd be educating MSPs on what the barriers were to a disabled person getting employment and retaining it. It came as a shock, I think, to some MSPs, that so many barriers existed to the disabled interns that were working with them. Like that you have to phone up 24 hours in advance before you can make a train journey if you're a wheelchair user. and that isn't always the time scale that's available to an MSP who needs to go to a meeting. So these sort of things we see as a way of educating the policymakers about the barriers that disabled people face, so that they can, again, improve the policies before they come into being to take disabled people's needs into account and improve them. So that intern scheme, we've ran parliamentary intern scheme, a third sector intern scheme, and this year we've added to that our public sector intern scheme, where we've been placing disabled people with public sector bodies like local authorities, the Audit Commission, things like that, where again they are, we hope, placed in a responsible position, paid the living wage, and they get experience. And again, the public bodies are being educated as well as the disabled people getting work experience. And we think, again, it's a way to begin to change the behaviour of some public bodies, maybe to get them more aware, again, of the barriers that disabled people face, and so that their services, what they do, is more attuned to disabled people's needs. So that's there. And a couple of years ago, off the back of the parliamentary intern scheme, we began to lobby for an access to elected office fund. We were aware that there was a fund available through the Westminster Parliament to support disabled candidates who wish to become MPs or local councillors, but it only supported people who wanted to become local councillors in England and Wales. It didn't apply in Scotland, and it didn't apply to if the person wanted to become an MSP rather than an MP. And of course, elections for MP only come up once every 4 to 5 years. So there weren't a lot of disabled people able to take advantage of the scheme, particularly in Scotland. So we wanted to see the Scottish Government introduce a similar scheme in Scotland that would apply to candidates for local authority council seats and the Scottish Parliament. And in the last year, after the 1 in 5 campaign was founded, which had cross-party support, we worked alongside them to try and develop the idea of an access to elected office fund, and the Scottish Government created that fund. And we're now administering it, and £200,000 being made available to assist candidates or people who wish to become candidates for local authority elections. So we are at the moment supporting a number of disabled people across Scotland in becoming candidates for local council elections. And the way that the fund supports them is it pays the extra costs associated with their disability. So it can't pay for campaigning. I'm afraid they still have to do that themselves. The rules for elections, they would have to declare it as a notifiable expense otherwise. But the Electoral Commission are happy that if we pay for taxis for a disabled person that otherwise wouldn't be able to walk to a meeting or get public transport to it, or to pay for software to go on a computer so that a visually impaired person can read emails and things like that. Things that will enable them to become a candidate and to maintain that position throughout the election. So we have committed funds and we will be supporting, I hope, up to about 30 candidates in the local authority elections. And we're hopeful, of course, that some of them will be successful in being elected, and hopefully increase slightly, at least, the number of disabled councillors in Scotland. So I think that's a big development for us, and we want to see that fund continuing even after the local authority elections, both in preparation for maybe prospective candidates for Scottish Parliament in the future, but also maybe to assist disabled people who wish to apply for public appointments. Because again, disabled people are underrepresented on the boards of public bodies. And there's a Commissioner for Ethics and Public Life, who also oversees appointments to public bodies. And he worked with us a few years ago on a plan to increase the number of disabled candidates for public appointments, and hopefully also the number that were appointed. And we the office of the Commissioner for Public Appointments was, as it was at that time, produced a plan called Diversity Delivers, and it indeed did increase the number of women candidates, disabled candidates, black and minority ethnic candidates, LGBT candidates, etc., for public office. But that increase was good over a couple of years, but it's now tailed away. And in fact, the numbers are dropping again in terms of the numbers that are both coming forward as candidates and being appointed. At least for disabled people, it has dropped. So we want to try and redress that and make sure that public bodies are as representative of Scottish society as they can be, which would mean basically about 1 in 5 appointments should be of a disabled person. So we're quite a way to go with that. So we're hopeful, as I say, that the Access to Elected Office Fund will become more of an Access to Public Life Fund, and support people in that way. Trying to think one other. Oh, sorry.
No, please,
I'm trying to think of all the projects we're currently running. It's quite difficult for me at times. In the last 2 or 3 years as well, we've established a partnership at a UK level with Disability Rights UK, Disability Wales, and Disability Action Northern Ireland, where we successfully applied for £5 million in lottery funding, which we disperse to disabled people's organisations and researchers to do research on independent living. Because one of the problems is that sometimes the researchers from an academic background want to look at issues that we as disabled people aren't particularly interested in. One of the big things is identity, for example. Well, it's an interesting issue, but it doesn't really help in practical terms a lot of disabled people. So we wanted to see research that could lead to practical outcomes. So there's about £3.5 million going to be made available in grants, and that grant making process has started, and 2 Scottish organisations have already had £40,000 or thereabouts in grant funding to help them with research that they want to carry out. And that was Learning Disabled People in one organisation, People First, and people who are mental health service users who run Voices of Experience are the other grant holders. And we're hopeful this week that a few more Scottish disabled people's organisations are awarded grants from that fund. That we can get some valid research carried out that can point the way to overcoming some of the barriers that disabled people face in participating in society. The last couple of years we've also been funded, first by the Scottish Government and then by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, to compile a shadow report on implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. And that's really important because Britain signed up to the convention about 7 years ago now, 2009 I think, and is required in international law to progressively realise the rights contained in the convention. Nobody expected them to be realised overnight, but you're supposed to try to make progress on all the articles and all the rights contained in the convention. And unfortunately, in terms of welfare reforms that have been happening in this country, to go back to Daniel Blake, there were complaints made by disabled people in the UK that instead of progressively realising the rights to an adequate income, the rights to health and life, rights to housing, that some of the welfare reforms that were brought in, such as the bedroom tax, such as sanctions, the work capability assessment, etc., were actually impoverishing disabled people, making them ill, and in some cases they died. So the right to life was taken away. So those complaints were investigated by the UN committee charged with overseeing implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. We gave evidence to the committee members when they visited Scotland, a lot of evidence of how welfare reform had severely impacted on disabled people over the past few years. And the committee found that the UK government had systematically abused the rights of disabled people through their welfare reforms. And that report was issued last November. So we are keen to pursue those issues, and we will be going to Geneva next week to present evidence again, not only on welfare reform, but in a whole range of areas where we think that currently disabled people are put at a disadvantage and their rights aren't fully being realised. One, for example, is the right to make supported decisions on your life that people with mental health issues and learning difficulties should be able to make, but unfortunately aren't always given the support to make those decisions, and instead people are appointed to make the decisions for them, guardianships, etc. The UN aren't happy with that situation, disabled people aren't happy with that situation, and we would like to see it addressed, and we're seeking changes in the Mental Health Act in Scotland so that particularly learning disabled people and people with autism are redefined, because they're not mentally ill. There are some people with mental health issues who want the ability to appoint guardians to look after their interests when they become severely ill, and we understand that. But there's a lot of other disabled people who would prefer that it was supported decision making where they retained some control over the process, even if they become ill. So we have to balance off those needs. But as I say, the UN are interested in that issue, and we will be giving evidence on that amongst many others next week. So I think I've covered the bulk of the projects that we do at the moment. I hope. One more. We've in the last year established a project in the Highlands, based in Dingwall, and that is because a great deal of decision making is being devolved down to a local level, or at least that's the Scottish Government's intent that it should be. And the Community Empowerment Act is there. And we thought that there's a lack of capacity amongst some disabled people's organisations, particularly in the more remote areas where it's more difficult to come together to meet, etc. That they're not being involved in the decision making that the Scottish Government at a policy level envisages they should be involved. So, for example, health and social care integration. There was a great deal of talk that service users, users of social care services, patients for the health service, would be involved in the decision making about how resources were used at a local level within the integrated boards. But the experience is patchy, but there are at least a number of areas where that is simply not happening, that the needs of disabled people and patients are not necessarily being represented and within boards, nor are their views being sought, particularly by those boards. So we set up that local project to try and, again, do the work that we try and do at a national level, to try and bring the decision makers, the policy makers, local authorities, health boards, etc., joint integration boards, together, try to bring them into the same room to talk to one another about what disabled people's needs were, to try and make sure that they were taken into account when planning for services, policy making was happening. So that it's a pilot project for us, because we've not had a local presence directly in any area of Scotland, although we are a network organisation. So we have, I think, 60 odd full member organisations across Scotland just now. Some of them very large, like Glasgow Disability Alliance, which has got about 3,500 disabled people as members. But some of them quite small, local community-based organisations with 30 or 40 members. And we want to be able to support particularly the smaller organisations that might not be staffed, might not have those sort of resources, to at least give them information about how they can be involved at a local level in decision making, etc. Community Empowerment Act again says that you should be involved in participatory budgeting for 1% of all local authority spending. That's a big opportunity for disabled people's organisations to be arguing for for some of the spend to go towards supporting disabled people to participate in society. So we're very keen that they're supported to take part and have their say in that sort of protest. They can also now make participation requests to public bodies such as local authorities, the NHS and others, where again, if a policy is being developed or a plan's being made, they can ask to be involved in that and state why they should be involved, because they can bring their lived experience to the table, which nobody else has. And again, we're very keen to support organisations to be aware of these opportunities and to exploit them, to take part in that process, because if decision making is supposed to be getting brought closer to the people, it does need to genuinely involve all of the community, not just the non-disabled parts of the community, etc. So that, as I say, is a pilot project. We hope to learn from that and maybe roll out that learning in other areas of Scotland where disabled people aren't particularly well represented in decision making and policy making, community planning and things like that. Sorry, go on at length.
That's fantastic. In a world full of sound bites, to get deep information and a good view of what's actually happening in the landscape that people can get involved in. Really important.
Yeah. Oh, so well. Yeah. No, it's not that we've been doing it, but obviously, going back to the social security issue, there's 15% of the UK spending on benefits in Scotland is being devolved to Scotland, and disability benefits in particular, disability living allowance, personal independence payment, attendance allowance, industrial injuries pensions, and carers allowance. And Scottish Government have indicated, committed in fact, to involving disabled people and benefit recipients in planning and developing the new social security system in Scotland. And to that end, this very week, in fact today, they've launched the recruitment for experience panels. And what they intend to do is recruit 2,000 benefit recipients to advise them on how the new system should be developed, what it should do and what it shouldn't do, and try and make a benefit system that actually serves people's needs rather than punishes them, which unfortunately I think is the way that the UK system's developing. And we're very keen to try and support disabled people to be involved in that process. And we do know from a long experience in running engagement events that some disabled people need more support than others to make a meaningful contribution. It's not just enough to just hand them a piece of paper and say, here's our proposals, what do you think? You do actually need to work at it to draw out that lived experience and their views, make sure that they're properly heard. And in the first place, with recruitment, you need to have accessible information, because about 1 in 4, between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 people in Scotland are essentially got literacy problems, and that doesn't just mean learning disabled people, but disabled people are much more likely to leave school without qualifications than non-disabled people. So they're likely to have poorer literacy, which means, again, if you get a 2-3 page letter explaining what the process is to recruit you to an experience panel, that's probably going to be fairly off-putting. Whereas if you get something that's an easy read, that you gets the message across in a friendly way, it may attract a few more people that would otherwise not be involved. And we need to hear those voices as well as more, better educated, more articulate voices which exist amongst the disabled community. But as I say, there's groups within that community that are more excluded than others, and we need to try and make sure that their voices are heard as well as others. So we're very excited with that idea, co-producing a new social security system in Scotland. But it does need to be thought through how you support the people taking part in experience panels to do that in a way that's really meaningful and that they get something out of it that's more than just the Scottish Government say that they've been listened to rather than that they've actually been heard. Two different things, we find it. You can have people speaking, but they're not necessarily heard. So we're very keen to support people who do that. Yeah,
I think it's probably very important to get your thoughts and experience in unpacking what disabled and disability means, because for a lot of people, or a lot of ways it's portrayed, it's sort of this thing that gets tacked on the end.
Yeah. Well, we work to the social model of disability, and we don't view people's impairments as their disability. Their disability is the fact that our society fails to adjust to their needs, and therefore either through sins of commission or sins of omission, we either allow barriers to stay in place or we create barriers to disabled people fully participating in society. I mean, literally, disabled people used to be locked away, away from public view and in residential settings, and they had to fight, to be allowed to live in the community. We trace our, ancestry back to the disability movement in the late 60s, early 70s that had that fight to try and get out of institutional settings and back into the community. But we try and represent all disabled people, and that means people with mental health issues, learning difficulties, physical impairments, sensory impairments, any cognitive impairments, any type of impairment where a barrier might exist within society against that person participating. Many of those impairments are invisible ones. This is one of the big issues, that the public's idea of a disabled person is somebody in a wheelchair or using a white stick. And in fact, that's a small minority of disabled people, and a much larger proportion of disabled people have invisible impairments that you can't see, and often they suffer greater stigma than the ones with visible impairments. So it's people with learning difficulties and people with mental health issues that are more likely to be excluded from employment than somebody in a wheelchair, which often comes as a shock to people, because they think, if we address the access barriers in terms of physical barriers, ramps and lifts in buildings and things like that, that they've done everything to make sure that it's a setting where disabled people can work. But in fact, it's the attitudinal barriers, the stigma attached to learning difficulties and mental health that prevents a lot of disabled people from getting work. And it's those attitudes in society, rather than just the physical barriers, that we really need to address as a society to make sure that, again, that disabled people can fully participate. Because in some ways, although on the surface, we've changed attitudes from the 19th century and locking people away, the stigma attached to them is still there, and the language that's used and the stigma now, particularly from the mainstream media, where disabled people are attacked as work shy, shirkers, scroungers because they claim benefits in the first place. That has impacted on attitudes right throughout society, and there's more hostility towards disabled people. That's reported by the disability charities that take soundings on this. Scope, for example, one of the big disability charities down south, they asked disabled people whether they'd experienced hostility in public places, and over 50% of them said that they either had been verbally or physically abused while out in public. So there's a huge problem there, and we do our best to try and tackle some of those attitudes, but they are very pervasive, and I mean even at officials level. And I'm not going to name names or anything, but I have heard people, for example, talking about people being parked on personal independence payment, and had to point out to them that personal independence payment isn't a benefit to do with employment. You can get personal independence payment whether you're in work or out of work. So people aren't parked on it. They receive it because they've got additional costs associated with a disability. And we as a society should be supporting people to participate, and meeting those additional costs helps them participate. It's the exact opposite of being parked on a benefit or being benefit dependent in that sense. No, that benefit should be seen as a support for people to participate in society, and taking it away from them is actually what results in them becoming inactive, because they literally become prisoners in their own home, because they can't afford to go out the front door. So, there's a lot of attitudinal barriers that we need to tackle. And as I say, we work to that social model and see the real barriers as being attitudes, as well as the physical barriers, obviously, and barriers in service provision, public transport not necessarily being accessible to disabled people, etc. And try and get, again, policies and services that really meet the needs of the people, all the people living in society. Because you meet the needs of disabled people, it usually helps non-disabled people as well. Public transport being a good example, where kneel down buses with space for a wheelchair user can also be used by parents, for pushchairs, etc. And older people who might have mobility problems but not use a wheelchair. It's easier for them to get on and off a bus now than it used to be. So these are improvements that serve everybody, as well as disabled people. Yeah.
So could you tell us a bit about the work you did with Paul Laverty and the research that you were bringing together?
Yeah, I mean, for Paul, we brought together a lot of statistics that we were aware of in terms of the disproportionate impact of the welfare reforms on disabled people. So that they were subjected to more cuts, more sanctions, etc. The work capability assessment was resulting in a lot of very poor decision making, where people were having their benefits stopped, and then 70% of them were successful at appealing, getting it reinstated. That shows a standard of initial decision making that's appallingly poor and shouldn't be tolerated, to be honest. And again, that the private companies carrying out those assessments seem to be working to an agenda of saving benefits rather than trying to support disabled people into work, which was the whole idea of the assessments in the first place, was that if a disabled person's, the barriers were identified, that the DWP could then work with that disabled person to overcome those barriers, instead of which they were just being put in a box, either fully fit for work, will be fit for work at some point in the future, or in the support group will never be fit for work. And none of that really addresses the barriers that the disabled person faces. And there was very, very little knowledge of what those barriers are and how they could be addressed within the DWP. And it simply hasn't developed that. And in the years since the work capability assessment's been introduced. So, but we also had contacts within the PCS trade union. We knew that there were targets being set for sanctions being imposed on people, and that PCS members were being subjected to disciplinary action if they didn't meet those targets. It could result in them being losing pay increments or eventually being sacked. And a number of people who'd worked in the DWP 20 and 30 years left rather than meet those targets. So we put Paul in contact with a couple of people in PCS. We put him in contact with a number of disabled people who we asked to come forward to relate their experiences, horrendous experiences, in terms of the work capability assessment and being deprived of benefits for months at a time while they went through a review process, mandatory review, which has no time limit put on it. So they could wait 3, 4, 5, 6 months for a review. And I think in 2015, 26,000 people waited over 6 months for a review to be completed. And until the review is completed, they cannot appeal against the decision. So all that time they're without benefit. Then they can lodge an appeal, and it might be another 6 months before their appeal's heard. So as I say, there's no alternative for that group other than to claim job seekers allowance, even although what they're maintaining is that they're not fit for work. So it literally is a catch-22 situation where, to get the benefit, you have to say that you're fit for work, because that's one of the conditions of job seekers allowance. And yet, at the same time, you're appealing your employment support allowance decision to say that you're unfit for work. And as in Daniel Blake's case, people are then required to take job search, actions, and are subject to conditionality. If they don't do enough in a week, they'll be sanctioned. And 20% of all GSA sanctions are on disabled people. And yet 20% of all those claiming GSA are not disabled people. So the numbers on GSA, the disabled people who are forced to claim GSA, they're being subjected to a higher level of sanctions than non-disabled people. And again, it's largely a lot of the people who are subjected to sanctions who are on employment support allowance are people with mental health issues and learning difficulties. So again, we think, and I think there's a lot of evidence to back this up, a lot of people are being sanctioned not because they willfully ignore the conditions that are being attached to their benefit entitlement, but because they don't understand them, because of the nature of their impairments, and therefore they're being punished for their failure to understand rather than because of something they've actually done. It's the things they've not done because they've not understood that they're required to do it. So, as I say, we put Paul in contact with a number of individuals who'd had particularly horrific experiences, so he could speak to them. And we also, identified cases reported in the press where people had committed suicide or died as a result of having their benefits withdrawn. So that again, he was aware of it and could integrate that into the story. I heard on one visit to Glasgow, one brother died of a heart attack at the assessment, and the other had a heart attack just outside in the street a week later. He didn't die, but he was hospitalised, and he was in danger of dying. And that's one family experiencing that level of heartache in a very, very short period of time. And both were being subjected to work capability assessments, although doctors had said they were both in danger of dying within the next 6 months. it's why they were subjected to those assessments in that situation is almost ununderstandable to me.
As someone who really understands policy, and that's what you spend a great deal of time picking over.
Yeah.
When you've read through the policies and the changes and reforms, do they make sense to you?
No, they don't. They are about saving money. And I think some of the policies have been adopted to save money. They haven't tended to save the money that was proposed that they saved. Some of them made smaller savings, some of them made no savings at all. But what they do is introduce a regime that is punitive, which I think discourages people from applying in the first place. And there is evidence now that people are being driven away from claiming the benefits they're entitled to. So, for example, in the 16 to 24-year-old age group of job seekers allowance claimants, then the proportion claiming that benefit in 2010 were 70% of all that age group who were out of work, or 70% of those who were entitled to the benefit were claiming it. In the last year, that's fallen to 40%. Right? That is a massive reduction in the number of young people claiming a benefit they're entitled to. And the only factor that's massively changed in that time is the conditionality regime and the sanctions that are being imposed on people. So we think that is strong evidence that young people are being driven away from the system. And of course that means that as well as not getting the benefits they're entitled to, they're not getting any support from DWP to find work. And when job opportunities become available, there is no way the DWP can contact them about it because they are no longer on their records. So we've got a disenfranchised group of young people driven away for benefits and also driven away from the employment market, which is the opposite of what the government's intention should be. Surely it should be to support people into work, not to drive them away from the service that is supposed to help them get work. I think there's a lot of unintended consequences with the welfare reforms, but I do think that the punitive regime is intentional. It is meant to save money by driving people away from claiming benefits and make them so ashamed of claiming benefits that they won't do it. And again, there's a number of people engage with us on social media, and they've had such horrific experiences in terms of applying for personal independence payment or employment support allowance that they're no longer even attempting to make the claim to those benefits because they don't want to be subjected to that level of humiliation as far as they're concerned that they've gone through before. And as I say, that saves the government money by a different route. It's not just that you redefine somebody from being a disabled person to being an undisabled person because of a work capability assessment. You can actually just stop them claiming altogether by doing that. The problem for the government is that there's been actual growth in the number of disabled people claiming employment support allowance, 400,000 people. And we think, and again we gave evidence to the consultation on the health of work green paper, that the growth of insecure employment, 0 hours contracts, etc., is probably having an impact on the mental health of the working age population. Because that level of insecurity does tend to lead to stress, and stress can lead to depression. And what starts off as just a mild depressive episode can turn into clinical depression if things get worse, if people lose their jobs, lose their livelihoods, lose the wages that they normally maybe had in more secure employment. We think the growth of insecure employment is linked to that growth in poor mental health. And the other thing that's linked to that growth in poor mental health is the punitive benefit regime. Because again, if people going to claim job seekers allowance are subjected to sanctions and lose 40% of their job seekers allowance for up to 3 years, then I would become depressed in that situation, and I would probably go to my doctor and ask for a sick line, and I think my doctor would probably give me one, because living in poverty, I mean, benefits are not sufficient to meet need, even at the level when you get 100% of them. So if you're only getting 60% of them, and not everybody's even entitled to that because hardship payments aren't available for everybody, if you have to live on nothing for 3 years, I think there's a fair chance you'll develop mental health issues. So there's been this huge growth in mental health. The numbers reporting poor mental health, and I think we have to look at the sort of society that we're creating, where driving people with care responsibilities to try and balance that against full-time work. Before we used to support carers, with children, older people, disabled relatives, etc., to fill that role as a carer. Now, that same person will be getting told that if they don't take up full-time work, they could be sanctioned, because the conditionality regime has been extended to people in part-time work. So, somebody that was holding down a part-time job and caring for somebody before is now being told you have to get a full-time job. And the stress of that again, the stress that they may be punished for failing to get full-time work, I think is going to, as more and more people are put on universal credit, is going to affect people as well. And it's going to have a very bad impact on the mental health of our society. Not just individuals, but that growth in just sheer numbers, the inequality in our society has been shown by researchers that the sort of gross levels of inequality in wealth and poverty that we see in the UK and the US, etc., result in poorer health, both poorer physical health as well as poorer mental health. People die earlier than they might otherwise in other more equal societies.
There's an intersectionality here with criminal justice system as well.
It very much is. There's been a lot of research done in prisons on impairments amongst prisoners, and a very high proportion of those who are imprisoned have learning difficulties. And a very high proportion, unfortunately, develop mental health issues, quite often as a result of their imprisonment. So prison doesn't tend to result in well-rounded individuals coming back out into society. Rehabilitation, unfortunately, is one of the rarer outcomes. So again, we have to think about who we're in prison in and why, because a lot of people, as I say, with learning difficulties, are imprisoned, for relatively minor offences, and then, whilst in prison, develop drug addiction problems, often come out with poorer mental health and are less able to cope within our society, and are more likely to reoffend as a consequence, and end up in prison for longer periods. So, again, people are being imprisoned for stealing food when they have no other recourse, I would say, other than theft. There was a homeless man was imprisoned for 3 months for stealing a Mars bar from a Tesco's. And, that is the level that the criminal justice system is descending to. And that man was starving, literally starving, when he stole the Mars bar, which was accepted by the judge that heard his case, but he still imprisoned him. said it was no excuse for theft. And yet you have to ask the question, if not entitled to benefits at all because they've had their benefits withdrawn because of sanctions, how is somebody to survive? It's pointed out time and time again. Trussell Food Banks, one example, and many other food banks not affiliated to Trussell, will only allow a person to take 3 supplies of food in the course of a year, and those supplies will last them 2 or 3 days each time. So you lose your benefit for 6 months or a year or 3 years, and in that time the food bank will only feed you for probably a maximum of 10 days out of the 6 months or a year or 3 years, 10 days each year. And you'll have to find other places to get food the rest of the time. So how do people do it? I really don't know how they're surviving. I mean, I count myself as incredibly lucky that I'm in a job that I love doing in many ways, and I'm relatively well paid to do. But I have many friends who are disabled people who have lost the benefits and been reduced to poverty. I've got friends who've been going through the PIP assessment process who have found it so incredibly stressful, the worry that they will lose their benefits. Even if they don't actually lose them, the stress of going through the process for which lasts quite often from the time that they're notified to the time that they're notified that they're going to have to go into assessment to a month, 2 months afterwards, when they're finally told that they actually have got an award. They might have gone through 3, 4, 5 months of anguish waiting on what is going to happen. And often these are people who have been awarded disability living allowance at the highest rate for mobility, at the highest rate for the care element, who are then told, nearly half of those who have got higher rate mobility entitlement are being told afterwards that they've lost it when they're transferred across from DLA to PIP. And again, that means they lose their mobility vehicle, their only means of getting out and about, and they'll often lose their blue badge. They'll lose automatic entitlement to concessionary travel, etc. So not only just losing their money, not just losing the benefit, they're actually losing their ability to interact with the rest of society because there's no means of getting about. And yet, they've got exactly the same level of impairment as they had before that transfer. It's the disabled people call Cadogan Street, where a lot of these assessments take place, as Lourdes, because disabled people go in and non-disabled people, according to the assessors, come out. But in fact, they remain completely the same as when they went through the door in the first place. They remain disabled people. They still have the same level of impairment as they had before. Stroke of a pen, you lose your ability to take part in community life. People are losing their cars when they use those cars to get to work. So they're losing their jobs as well. Yeah. Because, it's not as bad in city areas like Edinburgh and Glasgow, where there's a lot more accessible transport. But in some of the rural areas, not all the bus services are accessible. And even when they are, they're very infrequent. So it can be very, very difficult for people to get to work, when they're travelling 20, 30 miles, maybe to their workplace, without, a vehicle to get in. And basically 1 in 3 people who get a higher rate element use it to get a mobility vehicle. So a lot of people are losing their cars at the moment, a very high proportion. I think 15,000 have lost their cars already.
Sure. You mentioned private companies being brought in to perform roles.
Mm-hmm.
So What are they being asked to do, and which companies?
Well, I mean, this again, it's the privatisation of the welfare system up to a point. There are a number of private companies being involved. Capita, Atos. I'm trying to remember all of. They're two of the main ones anyway. Quite often they're associated with private healthcare, private health insurance. They've got associations with them, but they're being brought in to carry out these assessments. Now, one of the things is that it's no longer good enough for a disabled person to have a GP saying that they can't walk and a consultant saying that they can't walk. They can be assessed by a midwife or a psychiatric nurse and told that they can walk all of a sudden. Because the health professionals employed are generally not doctors. They're allied health professionals, as they're called within the health service. They can be physios, midwives, psychiatric nurses, whatever. They don't have to have any experience whatsoever in the impairments that they're actually assessing. And yet they can overrule a consultant with 20, 30 years experience of that condition in terms of saying that a person's not mentally ill when they are, or that they can walk when they can't. And these assessments are based on assessments carried out by private health insurance companies in the United States. A company called Unum, which is a private health insurance company in the United States, have had a big influence on the development of these assessments in this country. There is a revolving door between the private health insurance companies and the DWP, where very senior members of private health insurance companies are recruited by the DWP to head up their assessment process, etc. And also DWP senior staff leaving to join those private health insurance companies and heading up aspects of them on their departure. And we think that, amongst many that think that is not the way things should be developing. And we think a market is being created for private health insurance, essentially. And again, I don't think we're the only ones that think that is partially what this is about. Because if people cannot rely on getting state benefits when they become too ill to work or too impaired to continue working, then they will be forced to take out private health insurance to do that. Except that the record of the private health insurance companies in the United States is that they spend far more money on not paying people benefit than they do in actually paying out on insurance claims. So in other words, they employ claims adjusters that basically are there to prevent people accessing the benefits for which they've maybe paid 20 or 30 years health insurance. So you will develop cancer in your 50s and suddenly be told, no, we don't pay for that. Or you develop a mental health condition and find out that they don't pay for the treatment of that. Or don't pay you while you're out of work trying to recover from it. And it's Unum who helped develop the assessments, particularly for work capability assessment, which the PIP assessment is now based on, very similar type of assessment, a functional assessment. Unum are banned in 7 American states from providing private health insurance because the record is so bad at not paying out when people actually come to need the private health insurance for which they've paid. And they've had advisors inside, shadow ministers' offices and who are now or have subsequently become health ministers and ministers for social security, etc. So these are paid for by the private companies. They actually often make contributions to the running costs of the office, these prospective ministers, etc. And that's been across the political parties down at Westminster. And I don't know whether it happens in Scotland or not, hope not, but it's certainly been happening at Westminster level. And again, we think that goes far beyond lobbying. That is buying influence and is leading to policies which, as I say, in the long term, may be designed to benefit private health insurance companies because the state has begun to withdraw from supplying the benefits that people need to live on. And people feel, because of the level of insecurity in their work, etc., that they need to make private provision instead. And certainly, some of those companies have begun to advertise on TV their services in terms of private health insurance, etc., to a much greater extent than they were 10 years ago. Yeah. So I think it could be wrong, but I'm certainly not the only one that thinks that is a very pernicious influence on policy development in terms of social security and health in the UK, where it poses dangers both to the benefit system in terms of supporting people, but also to the NHS, because the private sector is gaining more and more contracts, and there may be, again, a move away from universal health provision to allow the private sector to step into a market that so far has been unavailable to them.
You mentioned earlier that there's this universal credit as a system rolling in on the horizon. Mm-hmm. Do you see this as a working policy, a working framework, or?
Universal credit, when it was first proposed, had a lot of support in principle from policy people in the third sector, because it seemed to bring together a number of different benefits, hopefully make the benefit system less complex, etc. However, in practice, the first thing it was supposed to do was make work pay. In point of fact, there are now more people going to lose benefit when they transfer over to universal credit than will gain from going on to universal credit. So they're entitled to benefits like income support, housing benefit, job seekers allowance, employment support allowance just now. Eventually they'll be transferred across to universal credit, which is less generous than the benefits they're being transferred from. And there are, as I say, there are now going to be more losers than winners. The second thing is conditionality being extended to part-time workers, which never happened before. Once you were working more, if you weren't claiming income support or job seekers allowance, you weren't subjected to any conditionality. So once you were in part-time work, and claiming tax credits, you weren't subject to conditionality. Now you are, and the DWP can insist that a part-time worker, as I say, with care responsibilities, has to try and increase the number of hours. And there are actual conflicts which have already occurred where people who are working on contracts that say they cannot work for anybody else are being sanctioned because they will not look for other work outside their main employer. Because their main employer is maybe got them on a 16, 17 hour a week contract and sometimes on a 0 hours contract. And if they look for work with another employer, their employer says that they will be dismissed. Yet if they don't look for work with another employer, the DWP says that they'll stop their benefits. That is what universal credit is doing. The other area of universal credit that is a huge concern to us as a disabled people's organisation is digital by default. That is an advantage for some impairment groups with the ability to access claims online, etc., may be advantageous to them. But for people with learning difficulties, for some with visual impairments, communication impairments, brain damage, etc., having to maintain a claim online and having to take job search activities online might not just be a matter of not having the equipment to access online resources in terms of job search, etc. It may be that they're completely incapable of operating an IT system, and yet they're being required to do so. And people have been, again, suffered massive delays to having their claims made down in East Lothian, where universal credit is being rolled out to all new claimants. And people have also been sanctioned already for failing to meet the conditionality requirements about accessing job search online when they have no ability to do so. And I mean, they are moderately learning disabled and have no ability whatsoever to access information online. It's not a matter of training or anything. It's not going to be addressed by that. They have not got the intellectual capability of doing what they're being required to do, and they're being punished for being disabled. That's all we can see. And the Social Security Committee of the Scottish Parliament have already expressed concerns about how universal credit is being rolled out in East Lothian, and as has the local MP, who we took some of these issues to, along with local citizens' advice bureaus, etc.
Hello. Sorry, I think I left some
All right. So universal credit for us is not working out the way it was supposed to work out, but it's proving a lot worse in practice than it even looked as though it might be in principle. And we've got really, really huge concerns if it continues to be rolled out across Scotland, which is the DWP's intention, that more and more people are going to suffer sanctions, benefit delays, etc. Very, very long benefit delays. We're talking months before payments are made. Even at the moment with universal credit, even if everything operates absolutely top of the system's abilities, they do not receive their first payment until about 6 weeks after they make their claim. And ask anyone without money whether they can get by for 6 weeks without anything coming into the house. And I think they'll tell you that that's just about impossible. So it means that people are running up debts before they get their first payment and then having to repay those debts. And of course, quite often those debts are to the loan companies, etc., and are being repaid at massive interest rates, which means that the benefits that they now get are being eaten up. And that means, because all their benefits are rolled up into that payment, including the housing element, that some people are then running into rent arrears. And some local authorities are now seeking eviction after about 6 weeks of rent arrears, which means, of course, in the universal credit's case, because 6 weeks is the absolute minimum that you go without a payment, that already by that week 6, the local authority is already talking about evicting you, and you still haven't received your first payment. If you then get your first payment and have to repay the debts that you've incurred, you're probably going to go into more rent arrears, and the local authority is probably going to move towards eviction. And that means there's going to be we think, a large rise in homelessness. And that puts a homeless person is going to cost the local authority a tremendous amount more than a sitting tenant in terms of trying to deal with their needs. And again, if people become homeless, they're much more likely to develop drug and alcohol problems, they're much more likely to develop mental health issues, etc. And they're much more likely to become physically ill. And I mean, there's a medical practice for homeless people in Edinburgh, and the average life expectancy there, the last time I heard, was 38, compared to an average life expectancy in a more affluent area of about 76. You get half the life expectancy if you become homeless. Yeah, so we're storing up problems, and universal credit is likely made them even worse than before.
So this digital by default
Yeah.
and the use of technologies, it brings to people's minds, oh, that will be efficient. that'll save hours,
Yeah.
save people doing jobs. Is technology helping here?
Technology can be a huge asset in terms of disabled people. As I say, some impairment groups will be able to read emails where they couldn't read a letter. Some visually impaired people find it a huge help in terms of dealing with correspondence, etc. Strangely enough, of course, if you ask people to then contact you in email, like the DWP, they refuse to do it. So at one and the same time, they require you to make an online claim, but they will not communicate with you by email, which I find a very hypocritical approach.
They insist on telephone calls or going in person, or
they insist on writing to you by letter rather than sending you notification by an email where you could actually read the letter because you've got a visual impairment. No other way you've got to read the letter. So you get a notification about your claim, etc., and you can't read it. So you have to get somebody else to read it for you. So I say digital technology can be a huge assistance to some impairment groups, but digital by default has been developed, I think, without taking into account the needs of disabled people with learning difficulties. Some still with visual impairments will find digital by default difficult because although a digital by default approach can be helpful, if the forums are not produced in an accessible format, for PDFs instead of a Word document, etc., they can be impossible even for a screen reader to read out. A PDF just appears as an image rather than a written document. So people have to think through what that means for some impairment groups, and I don't think that's been done at all. And as I say, particularly for those with learning difficulties, but again, going back to this, that we have a very high proportion in Scottish society, not necessarily with learning difficulties, who have poor literacy, who've been failed by the education system and have left school. And it tends to be concentrated amongst some of the older age groups, so people in their 40s and 50s. But there are still people leaving school now who have poor literacy. They are the people who are most likely to be benefit claimants. So the problem you have is you have a system designed for those of us who are in work and with a good educational background and used to using the internet on a daily basis, which is being applied to those with least access to the internet because of their income, least ability to use the internet because of the education system's often failed them or they have a learning difficulty. And so claimants, Citizens Advice Scotland surveyed their users in Glasgow before the introduction of digital by default for some benefits. And they found 70% of their users who were benefit claimants would need assistance in using online claim forms and completing an online claim form. So the problem is the DWP are getting rid of staff at the moment, they're getting rid of job centres. So there's less of a service available to help people, and they're shifting that burden onto the third sector, to organisations like ourselves and our member organisations, to Citizens Advice Bureaus, to other people in the third sector, without providing us with the resources to do that additional work. And otherwise, there are a huge proportion of people who are benefit claimants who will be disadvantaged by a digital by default approach. There should be choice available. That is how the system should be developed. It should be several ways you can make a claim. You should be able to make it in paper. You should be able to make it online. You should be able to have somebody assist you in making a claim, like an advocacy worker, etc. There should be a variety of approaches rather than just one set meets all needs. It doesn't. And the other thing about that is we believe, again, that in failing to provide various methods of making claims to benefits, the DWP are failing in their duty to make reasonable adjustments for the disabled people that use their service. And that means they are discriminating against disabled people because they're supposed to make reasonable adjustments to meet the needs of the people that use their service. And disabled people are a very high proportion of those who use their services. So when a disabled person asks, can they be sent communications by email, they should accede to that request. On the other hand, if a disabled person says, I cannot make an online claim, they should be told, no, you can make it on paper, you can do it by a variety of other means if necessary. So we think they're failing. Yeah.
So as per your coming report,
Yeah.
human rights
Yes.
issues.
These all feature very prominently in the report. Unfortunately, the Scotland report had to be quite short, so we contributed to an overall GB report, but tried to make sure that these issues were contained within it. But there are certainly issues that we'll be raising with the UN, where we'll be saying, we think you should be asking the UK government more about these particular issues as they affect disabled people. And one will very definitely be the impact to welfare reforms and digital by default approach. So yes, we will be raising these with the UN. What the UN committee will do is produce what is called a list of issues, where they will ask the UK government for more evidence and more information on their particular policies that they've adopted and have implemented, which we are saying and other disabled people's organisations are saying are impacting poorly on disabled people and actually preventing them from getting the rights that they're entitled to.
Is there any evidence of employers flexing to the changing situations in positive ways or otherwise?
There are good employers out there. We wouldn't suggest otherwise. There are some employers who do try and address some of the barriers that disabled people face. However, if you're looking at statistical trends, since 2009, the year after the recession started, at that point, around 49% of disabled people who work in age, Scottish disabled people who work in age, were in employment. Right. Now, it's 42% of disabled people of working age who are in employment. So in 8 years, there's been around a 7 or 8% drop in the proportion of disabled people who work in age who are in employment in Scotland. And that's a reverse of the trend up to 2009. Basically from about 1999 through 2009, went up from 39% to 49%. Since 2009, it's dropped alarmingly, I would say, to 42%. So that seems to suggest, in general terms, there may be individual good employers, we know there are, but in general terms, there are fewer disabled people in employment in Scotland, and that's both in the public sector and private sector, than there were before. And we think, and the Scottish Government thinks, that employment gap has to be addressed and has to be reduced, because at the moment, 81% of non-disabled people who work in age are in work, compared to 42%. So it's nearly double in the non-disabled population in work compared to disabled people, which suggests, as I say, the stigma, the attitudes, as well as physical barriers, transport barriers, etc., are working to push disabled people out of the employment market in Scotland. And we think that needs to be really seriously addressed, because there have been examples. For example, HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, in Dundee have been found to have discriminated against disabled workers on several occasions at employment tribunals in Dundee, where they actively sought the dismissal and dismissed people on the basis that they were ill or disabled. And the tribunals found that amounted to discrimination. Now that's a government department which on a number of occasions now has been found to have discriminated against ill and disabled people and dismissed them. And we think, again, disabled people or people with long-term health conditions are often the first to be selected for redundancy. So when numbers are being reduced for any reason, it's disabled people that tend to be the first that are selected for dismissal and redundancy. And that needs to be addressed. And one of the huge barriers to disabled people now exerting their rights in terms of employment discrimination is the introduction of tribunal fees. Because up until 4 years ago, it did not cost a disabled person to take a discrimination case against an employer. Then tribunal fees were introduced, and essentially a disabled person, because all discrimination cases are seen as complex employment cases, likely to be several days of a hearing, they have to pay £1,200 now to take a tribunal case. Now, for somebody who has been in employment, that is a lot of money. I mean, I would think that's a lot of money, and I'm, as I say, well paid. That is a lot of money to risk against the chance that you will be successful at tribunal. And as a consequence, the number of tribunal applications based on disability discrimination have dropped by about 40%. Right? So that is, even though more disabled people have been getting sacked, less disabled people have been able to exercise their rights to take their employer to a tribunal. And of course, if the discrimination recurred in recruitment and you're unemployed, your chances of coming up £1,200, I would say, are small to zero. So we, again, and I think there's a lot of evidence there that imposition of tribunal fees is preventing disabled people from claiming the few rights that they do have to not be discriminated against in recruitment and selection for dismissal. So there may be many more cases where disabled people have been discriminated against who haven't been able to take their employer to tribunal.
Well, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for giving such an insightful panorama.
Sorry, it takes a long.
Oh, it's brilliant. Is there anything else that you think you'd like people to hold in mind or learn more about if they're thinking about these issues? Watching Daniel Blake.
Yeah, I think the one thing to hold on to is to go back to that humanity that's expressed in I, Daniel Blake, between Daniel and young lone parent with a couple of kids who has to move up from London, and the other people that they come across. The shop manager that overlooks the shoplifter. People can choose to treat other people as they would like to be treated themselves. That's a very Christian message, I think. I'm not a Christian myself, but they could choose that way, or they can choose to stigmatise people and blame the victims of policies which exclude people from participation in society. And I hope that the lesson they take from I, Daniel Blake is, if we all just showed a wee bit more humanity to one another, we would have a much, much better society to live in.
Bill, Scott, thank you very much.